up, everybody? My name is Monique. I'm going to be chairing tonight's meeting. The way it's going to work is we're going to have a few presentations from the front and then time to discuss. First, John Riddell is going to be speaking for about 20 to 25 minutes. And we're very happy to have him here with us tonight, and are very thankful for his big contribution that he's made on the I can hardly hold them over my head, but the proceedings of the third and the fourth Cominterns, and he's going to be focusing tonight on an introduction to the debates around the strategy and tactics in the third Comintern, and we'll have plenty of time for discussion. So he's going to go for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then after, he's asked Sean and Jen to respond to his presentation in order to kick off a discussion on the relevance of these discussions for us today. So that'll go for a little while, then we'll have a discussion, and we'll have some extended announcements at the end. So without anything else, we'll go right into it. So go ahead.
Monique, could you tip me off every 5 minutes? Sure. Okay. How am I doing for sound level? Can I be heard at the back? Okay. If it gets too faint, shake your fist in the air or make gestures like this. Could you, did I ask you to?
Every 5 minutes.
Yeah, good. I'd just like to thank you for inviting me to come down here together with my partner Suzanne, who is right there. And it's great to meet you all. I tried to shake as many hands as I could before the meeting, but there's so many of you, it was completely impossible. I did bring along a bunch of business cards with my website and my email address. I would love to be in touch with you with correspondence afterwards on anything that comes up. Now, this evening, we're celebrating a publication of another 1,300-page monster to the masses, the proceedings and relevant documents of the Third Congress of the Communist International, sort of a revolutionary Marxist World Social Forum held back in 1921, just a couple of years after the Russian Revolution. Now, these books like this are much utilized by scholars in the academic world, but that's not really what they were written for. They were really written for people like you, active socialists, in the belief that they would help us in practical tasks today. The present book, To the Masses, lets you put yourself in the shoes of socialists long ago at a global assembly of their movement, the Communist International, or the Comintern. You can relive the debates among them, relive the choices that they faced. The delegates of the Congress were much like yourself in age and in diversity of origins, but they differed from you in that they had experienced the great Russian Revolution of 1917 and taken part in the massive struggle of the years that followed. And these events confronted them with a dilemma. Now, I'm going to focus tonight on the experience of workers in Germany. Now, this is something a number of you know something about, because you've been doing some educational work on the wonderful book by Pierre Roesch that's available probably at the back, and from Haymarket. And it gives a very insightful and reliable account of the attempts in Germany to lead a revolution similar to what had happened in Russia a few years before. And so I'm not going to try to tell that story. I'm going to try to focus more on the International Congress that was taking place, that was mostly a meditation and an argument about what had happened in Germany. And so I'm going to assume a lot about the events in Germany that you may not know. Bear with me. Fortunately, Sean here and Jen both know the German events very well, and so you can address the questions to them and they can fill in a bit when it's their time. Now, the workers in Germany at this time, 1921, had built the strongest communist party outside Russia. And its problems dominated the 1921 World Congress, recorded in this book. I should say, by the way, this meeting itself is a bit of an international congress. I should mention that it's going around. I meet comrades from Argentina, from Germany, from France, from the broadest range of countries. I'd just like to mention one of them, which I forgot, and that's Sebastian Budgen. He's my historical materialism editor. He's right there in the fourth row, and I'd like to thank you. It was Sebastian who suggested that I get re-involved in this work 8 years ago, which determined everything I've done since then, and has been very steadfast in his support and assistance and guidance to this work since then. But to continue, the German Workers' Revolution in 1918 created a strong revolutionary current in the working class, which, however, was still dominated by pro-capitalist leaderships in the trade unions and the largest socialist party, the SPD. In 1919, a government led by the Social Democrats actually waged and won a brutal civil war against the radical workers, utilizing proto-fascist army units. And a year later, when the rightist units that they utilized staged a coup, the Social Democrats and revolutionary workers actually joined forces in order to beat back this coup. But the deadening grip of the pro-capitalist leaders was still unbroken. The working class remained essentially paralyzed, while the capitalists regained their confidence and momentum, and fascist-type death squads began to operate with near impunity. Communists explained that victory was still possible if workers built a strong revolutionary party, and at the end of 1920, radical workers did just that, in forming a German Communist Party with hundreds of thousands of members. It launched a campaign for united action by all working class forces for basic demands that were supported by all. That was the famous Open Letter, the first communist attempt at a united front. It made headway, but only slowly. The party, impatient, then did an about-face. A new leadership attempted a general strike with the support of only a minority of workers, the so-called March Action. It was a fiasco, defeated with heavy losses. The leadership vowed to continue on this course, to continue with what it called a policy of the offensive. Within the party, there were several divergent responses. Many communists, perhaps half its members, were disheartened and quit the party. A minority, headed by Paul Levy and Clara Zetkin, opposed this, quote, offensive course and defended the open letter strategy, which we would now call a united front approach. Levy wrote a stinging public attack on the party's conduct, and he was expelled for publishing it. Meanwhile, the party's trade unionists renewed initiative for united action in the spirit of the open letter. The majority leadership, which was divided into two wings, favored continuing party actions designed to spark the masses into action. Although the workers were losing ground, they felt that if the party with its own weight could reverse this negative trend by throwing its weight onto the scales. The revolutionary working class was thus marked by divided councils, conflicting impulses, and abrupt changes of course. And that brings us to the eve of the Comintern's Third World Congress, which is the theme of the book and of my talk. I should say that what I'm now going to say is not common knowledge and universally accepted. These are questions in which there are divergent opinions among Marxists, including in this room. So don't take notes as if this was the voice of the prophet here. These are just some ideas for consideration and discussion. So my first point is that the leaders of the Communist International were themselves divided on the issues before the German party. True, the previous Congress had endorsed key points in Lenin's pamphlet on left-wing communism. During the intervening year, however, leaders of the Communist International, like Gregory Zinoviev and Karl Radek, had encouraged ultra-leftist currents in the German party, while undermining the Levy-Zetkin leadership. Zinoviev and Bukharin and Zinoviev and Nikolai Bukharin initially opposed the open letter. Executive committee emissaries were sent who were complicit in the most damaging errors of the German party. Many writers have claimed that this policy expressed Russian national interests, that Zinoviev, the Comintern's president, was imposing an ultra-leftist policy in the hopes of blocking adoption of Soviet Russia's more cautious new economic policy. The same commentators, some of them, say that his later support for the United Front was an adaptation to the new economic policy. Well, it's hard to be conclusive about a negative, but I find that no evidence supports either of these views, that they are essentially speculative. It is more likely that some leading Bolsheviks like Zinoviev were influenced by the ultra-left impatience so widespread among communist activists in Germany and nearby countries. Lenin and Trotsky, by contrast, held views not original so much as closer to those of Zetkin and Levy and were supportive of the open letter. The Bolshevik leaders were divided in the same way as the German comrades. Now, secondly, as the Congress began, it was not clear what its outcome would be, and that's interesting in itself. Most delegates leaned to an ultra-left position. Lenin wrote at the time, "We must wage a decisive struggle, otherwise the International is lost." He spoke passionately at Congress sessions, spent break periods in intense discussion with individual delegates. According to German communist Ruth Fischer, Lenin's conduct aroused the so-called left-wing delegates to, quote, a fever of emotional indignation. At one point, a delegate got applause for saying that Lenin ought to better prepare his presentation. As for Clara Zetkin, the most widely respected communist leader outside Russia, one leader of the Comintern executive wrote to Lenin that Zetkin was senile and ought to commit suicide. And yet the Congress succeeded in adopting resolutions by broad agreement. How is that possible? Reading this book, you can only conclude that the Congress itself was the key factor that opened the door to a resolution. The hundreds of delegates from dozens of countries spending several weeks in intense discussions shared a deep loyalty to the international and the global cause of socialism. That is what enabled Lenin, Trotsky, and Zetkin and others to win a hearing, opening the door to compromise and consensus. Even so, the stubbornness of resistance to Lenin and Trotsky's views is thought-provoking. Ultimately, the Congress adopted compromise positions. But even then, the more leftist delegates continued to express misgivings at the end of the Congress and afterwards, evidence of how deeply rooted their views, the ultra-leftist views, were in the ranks. Now, during the Congress, the viewpoint presented by Lenin, Trotsky, and Zetkin, initially in a minority, came to win majority support. Given that fact, the fact that it concluded on a compromise might seem paradoxical. After all, this was an organization that prided itself by deciding by majority vote. How come they didn't decide this one by majority vote? Obviously, there was a fear of a split. Lenin explained this approach in a private discussion with Zetkin. The Congress will wring the neck of the celebrated theory of the offensive, Zetkin reported Lenin as saying, and I think all evidence is that Zetkin's account is honest and accurate. The Congress will, I continue to quote, the Congress will adopt a course of action corresponding to your, Zetkin's, ideas. In return, however, the Congress must grant to supporters of the offensive theory some crumbs of consolation. We will focus our attention on the way the proletarians in the Marxist March action, while provoked, fought back against the lackeys of the bourgeoisie. Beyond that, he said in male-centric statement is typical of the period. Beyond that, we let a somewhat fatherly leniency prevail. The Congress came to unanimous agreement on the main strategic course summed up in the words "to the masses," but the leniency towards leftist delegates was reflected on other points. I think myself that the compromise served a necessary goal, which is too often neglected in the socialist movement, of preserving the unity of revolutionary forces that was indispensable to taking further steps forward, and that provided a principled and broadly agreed basis for further united action and discussion. In other words, the belief was that only through further united experience could this stuff get resolved. Now, one of the questions before the Congress was the conduct of the International's Executive Committee. I'm skipping a little bit here. In the Congress itself, however, this was not much discussed. In fact, only Zetkin spoke of the dubious initiatives of Executive Committee emissaries who had been complicit in ousting Paul Levy from the German party leadership and pushing the party into its march to disaster. Sometimes, in fact, the executive itself shared the blame. Now, this record of the executive contrasts with what we see in Comintern congresses, when all the delegates got together and the world movement's authority, in my opinion, was generally a force for unity and clarification. Nonetheless, in the Third Congress, the emissaries who bore the greatest responsibility for the errors were re-elected into the Comintern's bureau, its day-to-day leadership. Now, historian Pierre Roesch comments, "None of the fundamental problems about the working of the Executive Committee and its relations with the German party leadership were touched upon. It was left to Zetkin to, quote, speak the unspeakable." Roesch sees a wide gulf in competence between Lenin and, quote, such close collaborators as Zinoviev and Radek. In his as yet untranslated history of the Communist International, he adds, and I quote, "Of course, there is Lenin, there is Trotsky, but apart from these two persons and their bloc at the Third Congress, what leader of the International had the scope, the background, the sense of proportion, the authority, and also the necessary independence of spirit and soul?" So there it is, a harsh verdict on the Communist International leadership. Now, I'm going to suggest here a different explanation. Not to invalidate what he says, but just to point in a different direction. Perhaps the problem was not so much the personnel as the nature of the task. After all, Zinoviev was not an incompetent leader of the Bolshevik Party, whatever his record in the Comintern. During the Comintern's first year, Executive Committee emissaries had a straightforward task of drawing together serious revolutionary forces into a viable party nucleus, and the work went well. But once large communist parties emerged, they had to take tactical and policy decisions that demanded close knowledge of national conditions and familiarity with the party's entire fabric. The Comintern's membership's deep loyalty to the International endowed its emissaries with an authority that they often did not use widely. What the International needed was a better appreciation of the necessary autonomy of the National Party, the necessary limits of what the executive and its members could do. Because it was the National Party that carried the responsibility for conducting and winning a revolutionary struggle in its country. And that is, for all we say about the fact that the revolution as a broad process is worldwide, global, the actual struggle for power takes place in a single power, and that has to be understood. And I think you will not find that idea in the Third Congress. Okay. Now also, in assessing this Congress, we must also consider its concentrated focus on the experience of the industrial proletariat in Central Europe. Perhaps this was necessary given the crisis in Germany at the time. Still, 3 draft resolutions on colonial revolution from young parties in Iran, India, and China were submitted and were not discussed and were not published in the International's main publications. A symptom of a less than fully integrated global outlook. You'll find these resolutions for the first time in many, many decades in our book. The reports on incorporating women into the revolutionary movement were hard-hitting, but their spirit did not extend to the debate as a whole. Several comments from the floor reflected male chauvinist attitudes among some of the overwhelmingly male delegates. Attitudes deeply embedded in the prevailing culture. And these prejudices were mobilized in the effort to marginalize and silence Zetkin that I referred to before. We can catch the mood of these comments by an attempt to respond by a supporter of hers, a Polish delegate, replying to her youthful German critics in an ironic spirit. Young men sometimes behave like old women, and the only real man in the German delegation is Comrade Zetkin. Well, we admire his spirit, but yet there's something impossible. Okay. How long has it been? Okay. It took another 6 months before the International was ready to adopt the general policy of United Front. However, the Congress took a number of steps in that direction. It rejected relying on an imminent capitalist economic collapse to spark a revolutionary situation. Instead, the comrades analyzed how capitalism's boom-bust cycle can promote socialist awareness. 2, it affirmed the need to build a mass party of revolution, not just a small nucleus of devoted socialists. 3, it set the goal of winning a majority of the working class through committed involvement in workers' daily struggles. Zetkin formulated this as win over the masses as a precondition to winning power. 4, it endorsed the German comrades' open letter, the template for the later United Front policy. 5, it resolved to draw together the diverse expressions of resistance to capitalism in a united fighting front of the proletariat. This approach was expanded 6 months later to embrace alliances with non-revolutionary currents, such as the Social Democratic-led trade unions or the Social Democratic Party itself. 6, it integrated into the International's program what became known as transitional demands. That is, demands challenging capitalist property rights and power as part of a, quote, system of demands to undermine capitalist power and organize the working class in a struggle for power. 7, the Congress defended the principled unity of diverse revolutionary forces affiliated to the International. These achievements are a priceless heritage for us today. Now, as to the historical meaning of the Third Congress as a whole, consider the opinion of Italian Marxist Aldo Augusti. The grandeur and representativity of the Congress impressed on the world a constantly more tangible reality, an alternative to the capitalist system. There is no evading a sense of the historic solemnity of this gathering, almost a parliament of humanity. Yet for many decades, this Congress has been virtually unknown to most socialists. True, circumstances have changed vastly during this last century, but that is not the reason for its eclipse. The Congress did not just disappear from memory, it was forcibly erased. During the years when Joseph Stalin ruled in the Soviet Union, a concerted effort was made to eliminate memory of the early Comintern, including by the execution of most participants who were within Stalin's grasp. Publication in Russia of the Third Congress proceedings was canceled in 1934, its debates disappeared from the official records. What we are undertaking, all of us, the hundreds of people who have worked on the different volumes of the Communist History Publishing Project, and many of you, in fact all of you, participating as those who listen, who consider, who discuss, and offer their ideas as a part of making this project live. What we are undertaking is the recovery of historical memory. Revolutionary memory provides us with the language we use in projecting a social alternative. Memory is the map of our imagination. It is the factual basis for developing and testing policy. As best we can, we try to pass on and, where necessary, rediscover this memory and make it available to new generations to weigh and assess. Publication of the Comintern records has aimed to recover that memory for an important segment, a segment of our collective heritage. It has been possible only as a collective global effort in which Haymarket Books and its friends have played a leading role. As I said, it's a book written for socialist activists. Now it's up to us to help circulate the book and discuss the ideas in it as part of linking our socialist heritage to today's struggle and passing it on to new generations of activists. Thank you.
Thank you, and we'll pass it
So yeah, thank you very much.
Louder.
Stand up.
Thank you very much, John. First I just want to say that,
Does anyone have a box in the back? And then
There's several large books.
can people not hear me from the back?
Oh, we got something here.
we got a box. Fix it. Fix it.
Look at that podium.
Thank you for the box. So first, I just really wanted to say that this publication of these proceedings is really an enormous contribution, not only to the way that we understand this history or this slice of our own history as socialist activists, but also to it's a contribution to the way that we approach our activities today. And so on both of these fronts is really a huge step forward. So first, you know, I only have a couple of minutes. I just want to touch on a couple of points really quickly. If people want to know more about the kind of broader debates or the contours of the discussions at the Congress, feel free to raise that in the discussion, or any of the events in Germany specifically. I think that would be good to talk about. But first, just on the contribution this makes to our understanding of this history. A lot of us, especially here in New York, where we've been running a reading group, have our understanding of this history primarily through the lens of a really unparalleled book by Pierre Brouet called The German Revolution. This book really deserves its reputation as kind of the window through which we can actually see this whole context, not only the debates in the congresses of the Communist International, but also the whole socio-economic processes that are going on between 1917 and 1923 in Germany, and also with the Comintern. But it also must be said that Pierre Brouet takes sides in his own book. He takes sides in the discussions that he presents. And in fact, he wrote his book not as a history, in his own words, in his defense of the book, as his doctoral dissertation. He wrote it more as an analysis of Comintern strategy. What he said was the correct title of the book was Spartakism, Bolshevism, and Ultra-leftism in the Face of the Problems of the Proletarian Revolution in Germany. Rather clunky title. Which, you know, this book still remains the best history we have of the German Revolution. But as a kind of a Gesamtdarstellung, as a total history, this book actually has to, and by necessity, has to cut short some of the wide-ranging, deep analyses and debates that really informed what was going on at the Third Congress. And it actually raises a lot of questions, which we've not been really able to answer until now with the publication of To the Masses. To the Masses lays bare the kind of full vibrancy of this Congress, with a lot of the polemics and the debates and the sharp disagreements on full display. All of the dirty laundry is aired during this Congress. In many ways, this also offers a really new, a kind of a new picture from the paradigm that we've had so far of the Comintern. And it provides, for example, much more insight into the way that the theses on the tactics and strategy, which was kind of the hinge around which this Congress turned, it provides a lot of insight into the ways in which these theses were developed and how they came about. Like John said, they didn't start the same way as the Congress didn't begin the same way as it ended. And it also provides, with the publication of these proceedings, readers today have a lot more of a basis to make judgments about the decisions that were taken by the Comintern. It allows us to begin to transcend what can sometimes be rather narrow debates, for example, about the person of Paul Levy. He took a lot of positions that I think are valid for us to discuss, but I think with the information provided in this Congress, we can begin to look at the social and economic conditions in which these decisions were taken. Specifically, I think one of the contributions that these proceedings make is that it presents the disagreements amongst the executive leadership in a way that you can begin to parse out subtle differences that don't come through in, for example, the theses that are presented at the end. Specifically, I think we should take seriously the preparatory or the perspectives of the several members of the Russian party in the executive. They said that what is being put forward here in the perspectives that are given by one of the members, Karl Radek, what's being put forward here is not merely an exaggeration or bending of the stick against the ultra-left, but rather a single, unbroken line of orientation that runs through the second, third, and fourth Congresses of the International. The way this line is realized in the context of 1921, in the conditions of 1921, is expressed in the book's title, To the Masses. In contrast to parties of the Second International, the Communist International set itself the task of building parties capable of active leadership, but also through winning the majority, as the quote from Zetkin, I think, illustrates. Winning over the masses. As Lenin says in an intervention on tactics and strategy, and it's really a central intervention if you do pick up the book, he says, in order to win over the masses, thoroughgoing preparation of the revolution is essential. Both the passive centrists in Italy, Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the ultra-leftists, specifically in Germany, but also in Italy, have a kind of underpreparedness as the underlying basis of their errors. Is what is laid down in the initial perspectives of in the sessions on tactics and strategy. So despite some of the disagreements over emphases, this perspective on underpreparedness and the need to actually train a Communist International with people who are capable of thinking and acting flexibly, but based upon a firm grasp of communist principles, is really put forward. Lenin outlines this a little bit in a letter that he writes to the German Communist Party after the Congress, in which he sums up the lessons, where he says, we've got a Communist International we've got an international army of communists, but they're unorganized and they're unprepared. And we're now launching into a period where we're going to have to train all these communists, and they're going to have to go through a period of hard schooling, through struggles. And I think this really brings us to the second point that I want to make, which is another crucial achievement of this book. Congress displays an analysis. Through the analysis displayed in the Congress, you really get a sense of a method in action as it's developing. The Congress began with a sweeping portrayal of the economic situation globally, presented by Trotsky, and it is upon that basis, upon the decisions there, in which they reach a conclusion that revolution is not dying down. It's actually, we're entering a period of prolonged struggle. This was then confirmed over the coming 2 years, in which the crisis deepened, eventually leading to a revolutionary situation in 1923. But most importantly, it is upon that basis, upon that analysis, that the tactics and strategy were developed. And so the unity that they were able to forge, I think, and this is one of the things that I think we can take from this today in our practical work, the unity that they were able to forge was always with the knowledge that they had to go forward, that there was actually struggles to be, that they were going to face in the future. And that you can see that imperative run through all the debates on the theory of the offensive, on the March action, on the Italian question. This is especially displayed, just to close with this is especially displayed in the thinking of some of the leading comrades of the Communist International. Trotsky, Lenin, Clara Zetkin, and in some instances, but not all, Karl Radek. 17 years later, after this Congress, Trotsky wrote an article with the title, "Learn to Think, a friendly suggestion to certain ultra-leftists." Regardless of how we come down on the particulars of the debates, this is exactly what we get from reading the Third Congress. We learn to think. I think everybody should pick up a copy of the Congress.
Okay, I'm sorry, 1 second.
There is a seat up front if people are standing in the back.
Sorry, just decided to say something more based on the remarks. Yes, I need the box. Okay. Yeah, I'm good. Okay, so, sorry, my brain just filled with stuff listening to John and Sean. I'm trying to organize the most important thoughts, and I also want to thank John for the work he's done on this, and also for being, just so people know, John is incredibly generous with his time for anybody who chooses to study this material and asks him questions. He will have answers, he will have supplementary materials, he will spend a lot of time with you, not to put more work on your plate, but it is an amazing contribution. I want to raise really some questions and maybe some points of departure from what John and Sean have said, primarily around the way that the compromise was handled at the Third Congress and what that says about the relationship between the parties and the development of a leadership and a cadre. Because I think John makes a convincing argument that the main pressure for action around the March action came from within the German party itself. But it's also clear that the ECCI representatives at the very least played a role in encouraging the March action. And I think we have to understand that. Both Bellakun and Radek argued for a more activist policies, one in which party members would launch actions with or without the support of larger sections of the working class. And the issue of Russia, while it wasn't a plot based in Russia, the issue of Russia and the status of the revolution can't be factored out of the equation. And there's two quotes I want to read that are in here. Kuhn, writing to Lenin, says, "Here's what I actually told Levy." He's defending himself here. "Soviet Russia is in great peril. You are well aware of Soviet Russia's importance for the world revolution and what a disaster it would be for the Soviet state to fall. When you consider what it would mean if the absence of the world revolution causes Soviet Russia to fall in 2 years, you must reorient your line of march to break through the counter-revolutionary front. Do not wait standing on the defensive while the bourgeoisie strangles the proletariat." Similarly, then Radek wrote to the German leadership in March, saying that the situation in Russia was dire and that, quote, "help from abroad was necessary to raise confidence here in Russia among the masses." He goes on to argue that Levy must be isolated and that the leadership must pursue a more activist course. He says, "You must do everything possible to utilize the constant pressure of communist masses for action. Given the world political stakes, think less of radical phrases and more of deeds that bring the masses into motion. In case of war, think not of peace or mere protest, but of armed struggle." And so I don't think that this takes away from John's main points, that the March action can't be attributed to either the personality of, say, a Bellakun, or a reflection of the bureaucratic centralization of power in Moscow, which I think is how it's often portrayed. But it does point to the extreme pressure of events. Not only the pressure from a layer of impatient workers in Germany, the scope of which I think is one of the main contributions that John has made, but also the pressure of a revolution in danger in Russia. And I think understanding that pressure is central to understanding the experience of the Comintern, not only at the Third Congress, but throughout its trajectory. And those pressures greatly constrain the options facing Lenin and Trotsky, who were the most sort of clear-sighted leaders in the Russian party as they went into the Third Congress. They need to accomplish two kind of contradictory goals. The primary task was to reject the theory of the offensive and win the Congress to an orientation on winning the masses, to the masses. They needed to come out with a clear basis for future United Front work. At the same time, they wanted to win the greatest possible unity with as few losses as possible. They had already lost half their forces in Germany, and they were presented with the difficulty of their own comrades' role in the March action. And they needed to win those comrades over if they had any hopes of winning the Congress. And they desperately needed to avoid a split. You can see how this would be a hard situation. And this meant a fight within their own delegation to take a stand against ultra-leftists. In order to win Zinoviev and Radek, who would then need to win over the German leadership, they were forced to make a series of compromises. And Zekin, in a letter, said to Levy, clearly the executive wants the German question to be dealt with as much as possible as dirty laundry within the German delegation. And you can really see how that was allowed, at least on the part of Zinoviev and Radek. Radek gave the speech on the main thesis, which John, I think, described as kind of a cover-up. You know, it was like a holding the stick from both directions and not really accounting for his own role. I'm skipping ahead. And I think that became a problem. That attempt to sort of hold the stick from both ends really became a problem for the clarity that the Congress would be able to produce. Because central to the compromise was an agreement that the theses would not focus on an assessment of the March action itself, which had been a disaster for the working class in Germany and absolutely had to be assessed, but instead would focus on the theory of the offensive that was retroactively developed to justify it. And in many ways, this compromise was unsatisfying to comrades on all sides, and was tenuous and involved a series of concessions. And you can really see this when Trotsky spoke and really kind of laid down a line in the sand, and all the delegations objected and actually submitted a thing saying, we agree with the theses, but not Trotsky's speech defending the theses. Oh, yikes. Okay. And so, where was I? And I think what that did is that it muddled some of the discussion. I think the discussion of the Congress is incredibly rich. I think there are important debates to parse through, but I would say that one of the great contributions John makes is in the supplementary materials that really help you to understand some of the debates that are happening behind the scenes that then emerge on the Congress floor. And I will just say very quickly, because I'm over time, but I do want to touch on this, that one of the most fascinating and thought-provoking aspects in this volume is the different approaches to the debate that are argued by Zekin and Lenin. Both are amazing revolutionary leaders, but Zekin argues very clearly in favor of a much more open and public debate, and she argues for it a number of times. For her, the sharpest, most open debate possible, without any concessions to personal feelings, was necessary to clarify the issues and learn from mistakes. Now, Lenin, who can hardly be described as someone who shied away from debate, defended the compromise and had a very interesting point that he makes to Zekin, and it's in the appendix. He says, we must absolutely prepare the ground for a compromise. Now, don't give me, whatever. He goes, Clara, you will resist this as representing a cover-up and worse, but this will get you nowhere. We want the policy adopted by the Congress to become the law as quickly and with as little friction as possible. To that end, our dear leftists must be able to return home without being too humbled and embittered. We must also, first of all and above all, focus on the moods of the genuinely revolutionary workers, both within the party and outside of it. And I think Lenin's arguments here must be taken seriously, because not only is there a sense of urgency, he's also concerned that the Comintern not lose more forces. And he's also identifying another dynamic, the need to pay close attention to the developing revolutionary sense of a layer of workers who may be impatient but can be won with time. And this is an important element in order to be understood. And so when you read through the volume, what you're struck by is the enormous difficulty of forging a unified collaborative leadership under the pressure of revolutionary events. And I'm going to end by this. In a letter to the German conference, Lenin wrote about training a cadre. He said, The training of experienced and influential party leaders is a long and difficult job, and without it, the dictatorship of the proletariat and its unity of will will remain a phrase. In Russia, it took us 15 years to produce a group of leaders, 15 years of fighting Menshevism, 15 years of Tsarist persecution, 15 years, which included the years of the First Revolution, a great and mighty revolution. And I think that really when you look at the Comintern, the gulf is not between Lenin and Trotsky and the other leaders. The gulf is between that experience of the Bolshevik Party that Lenin's describing there and the opportunity and the experience that the German Party, which was much shortened, was able to have. So through the Comintern, the Bolsheviks attempted to accelerate that process and transmit their own experience to those leaders, but that can only be developed with time and experience, which I think is one of the things that John gets to very well, but the problem is doing that under the pressure of revolutionary events. And I think the Gordian knot that the parties of the Comintern faced is the thing that more than anything else comes across to me in these readings, and is the thing that we need to be preparing to avoid. Okay.